Guys, good morning and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead at ReadyCare. I'm not Chloe, who is on the banner, but I'm just taking over today's session for Chloe because she's away. So in today's session, we're going to talk about stress and more specifically, just breaking down the different types of stress and how you manage stress from a sort of a lifestyle point of view. So I'm not going to say go to a counselor, consider medications, give any relationship advice, any of that sort of stuff. But I am going to talk about the basics of how does one negate chronic stress as opposed to acute stress, which I'll explain in a second, to balance off the effects of chronic stress to make sure that it's not deleterious to your health, not harmful to your health. Okay, so let's jump into it. So just a couple of definitions to start off with. And actually, before we do, just a little background study that I came across a couple of weeks ago, which is really interesting. There was a study done in India. I'm going to sound like an awful conspiracy theorist, but this is 100% true and well documented. Dr. Asim Malhotra, who's a leading cardiologist, spoke about this on the Diary of a CEO podcast on YouTube last week, where he said that there was a study done by an Indian doctor who took people with, I think it was 80 or 85% occlusion of their arteries. So their arteries were all closing up, all blocked up with heart disease. So they had multiple blockages from a cardiovascular health point of view. And he changed 3 different things about their lifestyle over a 3 to 6 month period. He got them to exercise, and the exercise protocol in this particular intervention was walking for half an hour twice a day. And then he changed their diet. So he put them onto a whole food diet. Now, in this particular instance, it just so happened it was a vegetarian diet. And you might go, oh, not eating meat cures heart disease. Not true. It's nothing to do with not eating meat or eating meat, actually. It's to do with the avoidance of processed food. So it was a whole food, happened to be plant-based in this instance diet. There's many instances or examples of people going on a meat-only diet and reversing heart disease as well. But that's what this intervention was. Now, the third component to this intervention was meditation for 45 minutes a day. I think it was some sort of a yoga type based mindfulness type routine. So some sort of a yoga with a bit of meditation at the end sort of a thing. And he demonstrated what had never been demonstrated before. So they've shown halting of heart disease progression. I mean, you likely stop your heart disease progressing if you follow a low carb, kind of very low sugar diet that stays away from processed refined carbohydrates in particular. Not meat and fat, actually. You can include those in that type of a diet. But actual reversal. So he showed from an 80% blockage in the arteries down to a 60% blockage. So literally clearing out someone's arteries. Now, when they went through the literature again, so that's impressive enough, but when they went through the literature, the only factor they could isolate in the study that showed it was probably the X factor in terms of reversing the heart disease and the arterial plaque reduction of 20% in that instance, that your heart disease will stop, but not necessarily reverse. It wasn't exercise because there's been many interventions showing that as well. It was actually the meditation. So the meditation side of things was the mindfulness meditation aspect was what they believe led to the reversal of arterial plaque. So, and there are a number of mechanisms by which this can happen. So chronic stress, where you're constantly stressed all the time, and I go through the definitions in a second because it's important to know, leads to a change in your hormones like cortisol, norepinephrine, adrenaline, and so on. And those hormones serve a purpose. You know, if we need to run away, if we didn't have those hormones, and back in the day, if there was a saber-toothed tiger wandering up towards our cave or a bear outside trying to get in, you would need to understand, your body would need to get into a fight or flight mode. You would need to run. You would need to get that norepinephrine, adrenaline, and shoot off. And that's what happens in those instances where people get off the chart strength, like a mother will just get into a complete and utter panic and lift a car off her child. That's been documented and could never be reproduced because you need that extreme levels of cortisol and adrenaline for that to happen. So it serves an evolutionary mechanism. But in long-term low-grade inflammation, which happens from chronic stress, not acute stress, and again, I'll go through them in a second, is so harmful to your blood vessels, the lining of your blood vessels, your heart function, your weight. It affects everything. I mean, even as we sit here now, you know off the top of your head, if you get really stressed, you're more likely to look for sugary food. So that will, by proxy, affect your blood sugar levels, your blood pressure, your liver fat levels, your immune system, your sleep quality, and your weight around the midsection. So we know that stress can affect things like that. The reason that happens, which is interesting, I was only chatting to Chloe about this recently, is that in times of stress, you burn up a lot of energy. Your brain will burn up a lot of energy. So you're left in an energy deficit all of a sudden. So you get this big drop in energy all of a sudden, kind of like when you have a bowl of ice cream, sugar levels go up, sugar levels go down, you're starving again. So you get that with stress. Cortisol will cause that to happen, and norepinephrine and adrenaline. So you're in a massive energy deficit, and then your brain says, get something quick. I don't care what it is. We'll deal with the repercussions tomorrow and starting the day tomorrow. Get me something sugary quick for energy. And all of the reward centers in your brain, so the endorphins that you get, dopamine in particular, go crazy. Dopamine centers in the brain just light up when you see sugary stuff when you're stressed. The same thing happens in other states of energy deficit. Lack of sleep is a good example. If you wanted a group of 100 people to eat 500 calories more the following day and make poorer food choices, you don't have to tell them anything if you want to convince them to do it. You just have to deprive them of sleep by 2 to 3 hours. That's it. It's going to happen. So that's just the way the brain is wired. Being hungover, another energy deficit situation. And there are a couple of other ones. Dehydration is another one. So just be careful of all of those. So let's look at the definitions first, and then we'll talk about strategies for offsetting the deleterious or harmful effects of stress. So acute stress, this is arguably the least harmful in the long run type of stress. So an acute stressor is something like you're stuck in traffic and you know you're going to be 10 minutes late and you're biting your nails and you're going, Jesus Christ, would your man ever move, and nearly got through the lights, and you're just like really high levels of stress, but you know it's coming to an end and it only lasts 15-20 minutes, and once it's over it has no long-term negative effects. I mean, in a sense you could argue that your blood pressure goes up and that's going to be bad, heart rate goes up and so on, but in the long term it's not something that has a subconscious burden on your brain. You're not going to go, God, remember that. It doesn't happen that way. Getting in an argument with someone where your stress goes up for a while and then eventually dissipates over an hour or two. Having a deadline, I mean, that deadline, you could argue could be chronic stress if it was like a 2-month deadline, but broadly speaking, they're kind of acute stressors. So acute stress is not harmful. In fact, I'll talk about hormetic stressors. Now, hormesis, I'll explain in a second, but hormetic stressors can be good. So stress can be good or bad. This idea stress is all bad is not true. Stress gets us to jump into action. It gets us to do things. You can save lives when you have stress. You can do incredible things. But long-term chronic stress is bad. So what is chronic stress? Chronic stress is long-term stress that results from a continuous pressure or, something kind of hanging over you all the time or causing central nervous system activation over a prolonged period of time. So an example of chronic stress might be volatile relationship. It could be financial worry that's there all the time. It could be worry about a family member who's very sick or dying or, on drugs, or, fill in the gaps there. We've all had chronic stress. And this leads to chronic disease. Now, it's not that it always leads to chronic disease, because a lot of the time we've very little control over our life circumstances. We only have control over how we respond to them. And who am I to say that if you're going through something terrible, well, you should just react differently to it, because I've been through stuff that was rough, and that's not possible for the most part. And of course, it's understandable to be chronically stressed over stuff that is, life or death stuff, quite literally. So chronic stress is the long-term ongoing stress that if you don't balance it with something else, and I'll explain what you want to balance it with to offset the effects that it has, it can cause, you fill in the blanks here. It can cause mental health problems, obviously, depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, dementia. Risk of all of those goes up in a dose-dependent relationship with the amount of chronic stress that you have that you don't offset with something else. So we'll talk about strategies for offsetting it shortly. It will lead to increased blood pressure, obviously, heart problems. The list goes on. Just anything you can die from prematurely, cancer, everything goes up if you have untreated chronic stress that just wears away at the body over and over again. Now, a really interesting one to cover just before we talk about how to balance off the chronic stress with something that will cause it to lower down is there's something known as hormesis. Now, hormesis is a phenomenon whereby short-term stresses of the body, so an example is exercise, blood pressure goes up, blood volume goes up, respiration rate goes up, lactic acid builds up, like every single sign around the body of your body being stressed is going up. But then once the event ends, your body has an adaptive response to it. And you see this in, now this is a bit of an off the wall example, but you see this in firefighters who pull, dead bodies out of buildings. They get to a point that they're completely desensitized and they barely realize it's happening. And something similar happens, although in this instance, you actually become stronger. So a good example of a hermetic stressor is if you ever look at a bodybuilder or a guy who's like 14, 15 stone or higher, holding a lot of muscle, what you're looking at there is repeated stress and ripping down of muscle on a daily or 3-4 times a week basis, and then taking protein, having an adaptive response, sufficient rest, hydration, and so on, protein in particular, and the muscle building back up to become stronger. So the reason your body builds up those muscle fibers is because it's had multiple thousand micro traumas, which are ripping of the muscle under pressure, and the body senses that and says, we need to be stronger for the next time that happens. Let's build you up stronger. So hermetic stressor, examples of really common hermetic stressors are, well, the obvious one is exercise, intermittent fasting, what we call cold exposure, heat exposure, so saunas, stuff like that. Again, heart rate goes up. Somebody had said to me before, when you go into the sauna, that has to be bad for you because your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, your blood volume goes up, your respiration goes up. Incorrect, because by the same way of thinking, exercise would be bad for you. So in the short term, stresses like that can not only be good for your overall health, can actually balance off low-grade chronic inflammation. So all of those that I just named, exercise, fasting, cold shock therapy, and heat therapy or hyperthermic conditioning, are all examples of things that stress your body in the short term, but actually lower inflammation. And inflammation is the big problem with stress. Don't forget that. Chronic low-grade inflammation from chronic stress is what leads to a lot of the manifestations of chronic disease. So how do we balance off the chronic stress that's pretty inevitable with the, a way of getting that balance off so that we're in a kind of a balanced place so that our health is in an optimal sort of a level? And you do that by doing something that does exactly the opposite to getting stressed. So for example, and this actually relates to weight loss as well. So there was a really good study done in, I think it was Japan. It was definitely China or Japan. I know it was one of the major Asian countries. And every weight loss program they did in this particular country, the kind of general protocol was, it's pointless doing a weight loss program and stressing yourself with caloric reduction, stressing yourself with exercise, unless you balance it off with Tai Chi, I think was the example in this particular intervention. So I think it's either Japan or China where they believe that every weight loss program should have a minimum of 3 sessions, 45 minutes of mindfulness, meditation, all that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, there's been this negative connotation with mindfulness and meditation where people go, oh, it's kind of a little bit woo, and it's not. It couldn't be, I mean, the clinical literature and the data behind it couldn't be more robust. It's off the charts good for you. Another good example of a thing that people just kind of shoo away is grounding, which is walking in your bare feet. Yet they've done studies where they show that the viscosity of your blood goes down 40% when you walk in your bare feet. Immediately, your blood straight away thins out, which would reduce your risk of clots and heart disease and so on. Your blood pressure goes down, your blood sugars are better balanced, your cortisol goes down. So there are some incredible things that we might kind of shoo off as that's BS. And one of those things is mindfulness, meditation, yoga. I personally find meditation really hard because I'd sit there and then I'd just start thinking about, God, there must be a paper along these side of things. And I said, think of the paper, actually, I must go down because we need baking sheet for the oven. And then my mind is just gone. But I have a little bit of ADHD. And I don't say that as a, some people have that as a badge of honor. I was diagnosed with it when I was a kid. But it's amazing how difficult it can be to meditate. But even something, what I found actually for me is it can be anything that you fully focus on where you're not thinking about other things too much. So in my own example, it's golf. I play a lot of golf. And if I go out and play 9 holes, it takes me 2 to 2.5 hours. I'm not thinking about anything else other than my stance, my swing, where the ball went, what the lay looks like, what angle I need to go in at on the green, and so on. I'm just constantly thinking about that. Then I come back home and I'm reset. I just feel like I've walked into a new home, and you just feel much more appreciative. Everything is reset. So whatever that is for you. So a really interesting one actually when it comes to stress is another study. So my background is health science, so I love the studies, but there was a really good study that showed for anxiety. If you ever suffer from anxiety, so stress, you probably have if you're listening to this podcast, There was a really good study that showed if you go on a treadmill for three times a week for an hour, you would think you would see a remarkable reduction in anxiety. And I think the percent reduction was like 5 or 6%. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I thought it would have been lower. In fact, in other studies where they do walking, the reduction is like 40%, 50%. It's like 10 times that. So they said, interesting. So let's get a group and we get them to walk outside, not in the treadmill. And the reduction that they saw in that group was 60%, but the reduction on the treadmill was 4%. Now, bear in mind, these were people in a research center. They weren't on phones. They weren't listening to music. They were just on a treadmill. So what was the difference? Well, the difference actually was being outside in nature, the sounds, the smell, and interestingly, things passing by you in your peripheral vision calms the central nervous system. So it's one of these weird things that you go, that's wild. Why would it do that? But it just does. So passing things and them not causing a threat and doing that for 30, 40 minutes calms the CNS, the central nervous system. So much so that there's a form of anxiety training that you can do, a therapy, not training, where they'll actually sit you in, I haven't seen it in Ireland, but I've seen it in the States. They sit you in a little sort of a box and they'll have a screen in front of you and a screen on either side of you. And the screen on either side of you is simulating things going past you, like trees and whatever else, and bikes and stuff on the side. And anxiety levels go way down. I mean, more effectively than anti-anxiety medications. So what we need to do for balancing off the chronic low-grade inflammation that comes with chronic stress is do something that causes your anxiety levels, your stress levels, your cortisol, norepinephrine, adrenaline, all to relax down. And exercise is a really interesting one, actually. If you suffer from anxiety or stress, you probably don't want to go too heavy into high intensity interval training, spinning. You think, God, I'll burn up all of this anxiety. It doesn't work that way. You might actually make it worse by doing the high intensity stuff. I would do exactly the opposite. I would do a walk at a moderate enough pace, up to the point that you're starting to struggle to sing the lyrics of a song. So kind of a 7 out of 10 in terms of perceived level of exertion. I would do something like walking. I would definitely follow a whole food diet, a low carb diet. That's going to reduce your stress and your body's ability, your brain's ability to deal with stress. I would definitely do something where your mind switches off a couple of times a week. That might be the Headspace app where you spend 10 minutes listening to guided meditation. It's a free app, I think, or it was at one stage. You could do, even if you go onto YouTube and you just type in guided meditation, doing something like that. I've done it before, sitting up in bed a couple of times a week makes a huge difference if you are stressed. And so exercise, whole food diet, cold shock therapy can be good. Ice baths, phenomenal for your brain health, your mental health, perceived levels of stress and so on. I mean, just phenomenal. If you look, I've done a separate podcast in it, but if you look up the studies on it, I mean, it reduces negative emotions, anxiety, increases your ability to deal with stress in the following 4 to 8 hours. It's unbelievable what it does. And if you put that side by side with an anti-anxiety medication, it blows it out of the water. The ice baths do. Saunas will help. So saunas and cold shock therapy are phenomenal for stress management. Low intensity exercise and a whole food diet, so you're not adding to the overall inflammation. So the key thing here is what's still on the screen. You have to balance the acute and chronic stress that creates the low-grade systemic inflammation that can lead to chronic disease and all of the other brain health problems with something like meditation, walking, whole food diets, saunas, ice baths, something along those lines. So hopefully you've taken something away from today, guys. Appreciate you being here. This was just a quick one, but just wanted to give you a kind of an overview of what the literature shows and put it into place. All right. Thanks for joining me, guys. Really appreciate you being here, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye-bye.